To say we only met 3 minutes ago, you know an awful lot about me. I do not have the glories of PowerPoint to show you, but I do have a handout, an old Paleolithic technique, and it will be a lovely souvenir of this. So if you want to take them, there's only 2 images, and I'm sure you know the Duchamp image. You may even have it tattooed on you somewhere. So thanks to Bart, I don't have to read the title, I will just go into it. But I'm glad that you mentioned the poet, because coming here and going to academic conferences, I always feel somewhat schizophrenic. Because both Bob Brown and Gertrude Stein were really formative influences to me, particularly Gertrude Stein as a young writer, and particularly looking towards what in the 60s we really believed in a language revolution. We thought something could change there. And what Stein really gave to me was a wonderful liberation into a non-representational poetry, and I think that has been a lasting effect of Stein. And I actually feel talking about Stein here is a bit the way that Levinas says about Mallarmé, you know, to explain Stein is to betray her. In his time in Western Man, the often vituperative and sometimes venomous Wyndham Lewis excoriates the work of Gertrude Stein, casting her, along with James Joyce, as one of a waxing coterie of time-obsessed revolutionary simpletons. Lewis singles out for his animadversions Stein's composition as explanation, as well as the story of Melanctha in Stein's first book, the 1909 Three Lives, referring to the style of the latter as a prose song and likening it to a cold black suet pudding. Well, it depends on what you think of suet pudding. Reading the 3 short chapters devoted to Stein, it becomes obvious that the ineffectiveness of Lewis's attack is in direct proportion to the paucity of Stein's work that he addresses. Lewis's book first appeared in 1927, by which time Stein had published, as well as 3 Lives and Composition and as Explanation, Tender Buttons, Geography and Plays, and The Making of Americans, all marked by an undeniable stylistic variety and investigative vector. Ironically, 3 Lives is one of Stein's less opaque texts, and certainly more reader-friendly than the near 1,000-page Leviathan, The Making of Americans, set in perilously Lilliputian 10-point type, in which Stein explores, among other photodynamic innovations, the transposition of the cinematic technique of the time frame into literature as a method for verbal composition, and thereby offering an innovative rethinking of the cognitive temporality of reading. At Harvard, the young Stein studied with Ugo Münsterberg, whose psychological study of film, the silent photoplay, appeared in 1916. In it we find the following passage on cinematic movement in a section called Depth and Movement. We find that the movement is perceived, but that the eye does not receive the impressions of true movement. It is only a suggestion of movement, and the idea of motion is to a high degree the product of our own reaction. Münsterberg is discussing cinematic continuity, which is, as Deleuze phrases it, a false continuity. The human eye perceives cinematic film movement at 18 frames per second. Current commercial films are shot at 24 FPS, and at slower than 18 FPS, the illusion of a fully kinetic continuity disintegrates. Although I personally date the birth of cinema to Cromanian times and the caves of Lascaux and Altamira, we can arguably date the birth of cinema in America to the Chicago exhibition of 1893, when Thomas Edison's kinetoscope proved to be one of the most popular interactive attractions. For 25 cents, a visitor could drop her coin into a slot and enjoy the retinal miracle of a dancing girl for the unbearable eternity of 30 seconds. Earlier than both Edison's kinetoscope and Münsterberg's psychological study of film are the photographic experiments of 2 others now generally credited as being pioneers of early cinema, Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Marais. Muybridge began his investigations into rapid motion photography in 1872, eventually publishing his book The Horse in Motion in 1882, and 5 years later his colossal 11-volume Animal Locomotion. For his own part, Marie developed independently in France a photographic gun, and this was 1882, capable of shooting 12 consecutive frames per second, going on subsequently to make movies of high quality at a resolution of 60 FPS. Following on the pioneering work of Muybridge and Marie, Italian futurist Anton Giulio Bragalia developed his own brand of photodynamism, utilizing shutter speeds on a camera of 1000 FPS, and launched the first manifesto of futurist photodynamism in 1913. We can date the birth of the time image then to the later quarter of the 19th and first decade of the 20th century, and an interest in the time image and the experimental application of chronophotography outside the photographic arts is evident among Stein's contemporaries in the other visual arts, notably Duchamp's series of nudes descending a staircase, and Giacomo Balla's 1912 painting Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash that we actually now have in Buffalo. That Balla turned to chronophotography as a solution to the analytic stasis of cubism is telling, suggesting that Stein too advanced from her cubist portraits in the 1914 Tender Buttons to the intricate repetitive patterns of the portraits, her cubist portrait, to the intricate repetitive patterns of the portraits and the later parts of the Making of Americans. Curiously, before the actual advent of cinema, chronophotography effectively exposed avant le lettre, the fetishistic mechanism of filmic frame continuity, the progression of near identical visual units, the freezing of frame time. Stein's If I Told Him, a completed portrait of Picasso from 1923, contains a section which might conceivably be taken as a description of Bragalia's photodynamism. Shutters shuttered open, so do queen. Shutters shut and shutters and so shutters shut and shutters and so shutters and so shutters shut and so shutters shut and shutters and so shutters shut and so and also and also and so and so and also. If we take a look at each of the 12 visage units that make up Bragalia's photodynamic portrait of a woman, that's on the handout. I can only make out 7, but there's apparently 12 there. So if we take a look at each of the 12 visual image units that make up Bragalia's photodynamic portrait of a woman, and transpose each into a linguistic unit, a paragraph or a stanza, we will arrive at something like the following 12 sentences from Stein's long gay book. Someone being loving is going on loving. Someone being certain that loving is something is going on loving. Someone going on loving is certain that loving is something. Someone loving is certain that that one is going on loving. Any loving is certain, and anyone being certain is going on loving. Someone loving is certain that going on loving is something. Some are certain of going on loving as being existing. Some are completely certain of going on loving being existing. Some are certain about loving being about loving not being existing. Some are not certain about loving being about loving not being existing. Some are certain about loving going on about loving not going on. Some are certain about loving going on about loving not going on. Stein aims in such passages for a writing composed in a continuous present, a beginning again and again and again and again, accomplishing this time sense by a multitudinous deployment of selective vocabulary and a technique of reiteration evidenced in the 2 short passages I've read. Utilizing predominantly participles, gerunds and impersonal pronouns, Stein creates texts that hover on the brink of semantic tautology and a grimly impressive Carthusian sparseness. Pruned as they are of all representational details and personal references, her texts develop by way of minuscule semantic increments or modifications. The effect on the reader is one of extreme cognitive deceleration, in which the ratio of signal to redundancy is tipped in extreme favour of the latter. It is the identical technique of analogical chronophotography that Duchamp employs for his composition Nude Descending a Staircase, which is on the other side. Perhaps Stein's investigations into temporal deferral are best seen in her Poetics of Now, in a temporal deixis uncannily haunted by Hegel's reflection in chapter 1 of the Phenomenology of Spirit on the problematics of self-certainty. I wish now I'd actually got that passage from Hegel, but we can talk about that later possibly. So here is Stein. I wish now that it is now. I will tell very well what I think now, but not now, but now. Oh yes, now. What do I think now? I think very well of what? Now. What is it now? It is this now. As well as enacting the necessary deferral of temporal deixis, this short passage from Stanzas in Meditation captures in nuce the mechanics of the camera shutter. Ironically, Bragalia believed his photodynamism to be oppositional and superior to cinematography, especially the latter's synthetic and analytic impotence. As the following passage from the Manifesto avers, cinematography does not trace the shape of movement. It subdivides it without rules, with mechanical arbitrariness, disintegrating and shattering it with any kind of aesthetic concern for rhythm. It is not within its coldly mechanical power to satisfy such concerns, besides which cinematography never analyses movement. It shatters it in the frames of a film strip, quite unlike the action of photodynamism, which analyses movement precisely in its details. And cinematography never synthesizes movement either. It merely reconstructs fragments of reality, already coldly broken up in the same way as the hand of a chronometer deals with time, even though this flows in a continuous and constant stream. Indeed, Bragalia's remarks additionally proffer an accurate description of Stein's practice of writing, in which we trace through each paragraph the shape of a textual movement without subdivisions, analysing movement precisely in its semantic details. Stein offers one of her most notorious claims in her 1925 Composition as Explanation. Quote, "The time of composition is the time of composition." Unquote. A seemingly tautological declaration that gains a certain lucidity in the light of Bragalia's claims. Stein has no desire to compose a referential text that carries representational or narrative time, but rather the mutating meanings occurring within the actual present temporal moment of composition. The writing is abstract in the sense that it is non-narrational, non-representational, and dehumanized. It is its own movement and moment. Stein's achievement is transpositional, a deployment of the mechanism of cinematic and photodynamic frame time onto the semantic content of prose paragraphs, in order to bring about a veritable revolution in the psychology and experience of reading, which Stein defamiliarizes by subjecting the reader to the uncanniness and the unheimlichkeit encounter with near textual stasis, by way of this transposition of cinematic frame time into textual reading time. I want to move on to Bob Brown, because Bob Brown seems equally seduced by cinema, but with a totally different temporal vision to it. And so these are two very contrasting sections. So I'll move on to Bob Brown's The Readers. Gershon Lehrman described Robert Carlton Brown's 1930 book Gems as the greatest spoof ever published at the expense of censorship. And doubtless Brown's short manifesto of the year before, The Readers, might similarly be received as a sly wink to the futurist fou amour embrace of technology and technological determinism, a tongue-in-cheek celebration of the optical bias in the West, and the greatest spoof ever published at the expense of the conventional book industry. Brown advances a model alternative to the Codex in a pataphysical vision of cinematic speed applied to reading, via a reading device, and it's not unlike the Picabia here. If you imagine the two spools there, this actually looks like two reading machines broken. It really does. A pataphysical vision of cinematic speed applied to reading via a reading device that allows filmed text to be read by way of real time, R-E-E-L time. Writing, affirms Brown, must become more optical, more eye-teasing, more eye-tasty, to give the word its due and tune in on the age. Books need to be replaced, he claims, by modern word conveyors. Reading will have to be done by machine, microscopic type on a movable tape running beneath a slot equipped with a magnifying glass and brought up to life size before the reader's bird-like eye, saving white space, making words more moving, outdistancing the flatulent, winded ones and bringing the moment brightly to us. Brown's call to a miniaturization and portability is accompanied by an incontrovertible affirmation of the dynamics of contemporary living. Quote, "To continue reading at today's speed, I must have a machine. A simple reading machine which I can carry or move around, attached to an old electric light plug and read 100,000 word novels in 10 minutes, if I want to, and I want to." Brown aligns his invention with the cinematic talkies, conceiving the material base for his readers in the form of a transparent, tough tissue roll, reminiscent of a reel of film or typewriter ribbon, onto which is printed microscopic texts. This film, Brown informs, quote, "unrolls beneath a narrow strip of strong magnifying glass, 5 or 6 inches long, set in a reading slit." The invention of the first reading machine is credited to Agostino Ramelli, an Italian military engineer who first described a book wheel in his 1588 book Le diversi et artificiosi macchina. Ramelli's book wheel, an alternative version of the revolving bookstand, was a device designed to allow a single person to read a variety of heavy books in one location with ease. The books are rotated vertically, much like a Ferris wheel, as opposed to a flat rotating table surface. A reverse-engineered version of Ramelli's device was constructed by architect Daniel Libeskind and shown at the 1986 Venice Biennale. However, Brown's machine, if not originary, is unmatched in its sophistication and miniaturization. There is a speed regulator and an adjustable rod allowing the magnifying glass to be moved closer or more distant from the type, and in that way changing the point size of the letters. Brown is not only looking to the quantitative potential of importing the high-speed kinetics of cinema into reading, but also, like Stein, in altering the consciousness of the reader. Indeed, the new reading device will promote new styles of writing. The short manifesto, published in 150 copies 5 years after Stein's The Making of Americans appeared, provides one example of such a text that strongly suggests a satiric intent, specifically a parody of Marinetti's suggestions in his technical manifesto of futurism, and possibly a playful allusion to Eugene Jolas's orthographic reforms outlined in his Revolution of the Word, most notably the Joycean portmanteau. Parody and playfulness apart, Brown's document remains uncannily prescient of the death of the book and the birth of Kindle, texting, tweeting, and in its proclivities situates the opposite to Stein's use of photodynamism or chronophotography. In envisaging a quantitative increase in reading, in which cinematic surface time, i.e. the mirage time of filmic narrative, is incorporated into a movie device for reading, Brown, in sharp contrast to Stein, focuses on the accelerated, not decelerated possibilities of cinematic time transposed onto textual reading practice. Brown presents an impressionistic approximation to the optical continuity of reading matter as it appears spinning past the eye out of a word machine, in which a stream of consciousness gives way to a reel of consciousness. And this section, all the words are connected by M dashes. I have to try to work that into. I see 1450 invention, movable type, Gutenberg, Winking, de Werder, Johnny the Caxton through Chinese centuries before, printed 1,000-page book on silk leaves furnished by local silkworms, no two leaves tinted alike, printing from dainty porcelain type, stain, stuff makes teacups, dreams, Shakespeare making, bending over, workbench making language laboriously, bellowing, blacksmith turning out grotesqueries. Brown's 1931 follow-up to his manifesto, Readers for Bob Brown's Machine, is significant, if only for the panoply of contributors, including James Joyce, Marinetti, and yes, of course, Gertrude Stein herself, who contributed a demure text, "We Came, a History," tenuously rendered a reading by her repetitive use of the equation sign between clauses and sentences. History must be distinguished equal from mistakes, equals history must not be what it is, equals happening. History must not be about, equals dogs and balls in all, equals, goes on for about another 26 lines. Stein's anemic contribution stands in contrast to Sidney Hunt's festive pulverization of language and its attendant time scheme in morning, night, car, and nocturnal day realm. And I should mention here too, there's another one included, and I inadvertently did not bring it, but a wonderful piece by Alexander Lincoln Gillespie that is fantastic. This is Sidney Hunt's version. Black riders crash by hell, bent for leather, uppercase, lowercase, both together, chanting variously, printed action at longest movable type at breakneck gallop, daredevils, commoners. Stein's contribution does prove, however, that Bob and Gertrude did go to the movies together. After all, even if they didn't share each other's popcorn.